Good morning, everyone. Good morning, fellas.
Good morning.
Good morning, Anna.
There are bios, I believe, in everyone's folder. So this is going to be a big conversation this morning. So I'm not going to introduce each of our speakers, with whom I'm sure you're, if not already familiar, become familiar. A quick Google search will do the trick. So I'm delighted and honored that Suzanne and Aaron, et cetera, have invited me to moderate this conversation, and we'll see how it goes. What we'll do is we'll just start with some questions here to each of the panelists, and then I'll have a question for an individual panelist, and we'll open it up to you. The most important part of our conversation this morning is the part that you join us in. So feel free to interrupt each other. I think everyone will feel more comfortable if you all jump in, right? Got it? Okay, great. So at the heart of this conference is the conviction that becoming a good person is deeply related to becoming a good professional. And each of the authors that sit here on either side of me have written books to try to help good people become good professionals and good professionals become good people. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get the conversation going. So as I read each of these books, it struck me that they all respond to page 1 of Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. I'm sure you're familiar with that book, but if you're not, MacIntyre opens his 1981 After Virtue by drawing from a science fiction novel, The Canticle of Leibowitz, in which the world has suffered an apocalyptic catastrophe. And the only thing that remains of scientific knowledge are these fragments strewn about. But nobody has any way to make sense of the fragments because they've lost a sense of the whole. Each of the authors at this table have tried to respond to this fragmentary situation in their disciplines. At least that's how I've read these books. So I ask my friends up here, what suggestions do you have to make your disciplines whole? And I think what we'll do is maybe start this way, and then the next time we'll start this way. Yeah, so Andrew, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Can you hear me okay? Okay. The book I've written, if I were to summarize it very quickly, capitalism is broken, and so is business education.
Sorry, I totally messed up. I already messed up. We were supposed to start with these mini book talks, and I already asked my first question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Suzanne.
We can do our book talks and then weave in our answers.
Shoot, do your book talk.
Okay.
It can't be more than 5 minutes.
Oh, it won't be more than 5 minutes.
And then answer the great Alasdair MacIntyre question.
Wait, in succession or wait, go do the
Should we
book
go
talks
down?
and then?
Five,
All right, let's do the book talks first.
Book talks.
Okay,
We didn't
just
rehearse
like
this.
take 2. We're starting over. Pretend I said nothing. Book talk number 1.
Okay. I want to talk about Alison MacIntyre. My book, the central thesis is capitalism is broken, and so is business education. The markers that capitalism is broken can be seen in the environmental world: climate change, species extinction, ocean acidification, freshwater availability. In the social environment, we can see it in wealth inequality. We're seeing levels of inequality, wealth and income inequality that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. These are not unintended consequences. These are not externalities. The market is doing exactly what it's designed to do, and it is doing this. Business schools are starting to focus on these issues. They are developing courses on these topics. The rub is that they're taking a course and dropping it into a curriculum that remains unchanged. It's been unchanged for about 5 decades. So we'll teach about climate change or inequality, but we're going to go into the rest of the curriculum, and the purpose of the corporation is solely to make money for the shareholder. Government has a limited role in the market. Efficiency is always good. People are inherently selfish. Environment only has value in terms of its monetary resources for our supply chains and our consumption. And so it won't work. And so the book is calling that out and then offering ways to think differently about how we teach future business leaders. At the core of it, at the root of it, is the idea that we need to bring back the notion of a vocation or calling in management. I've been doing this for 30 years. When I first started teaching, students went to business school because they wanted to get rich. They wanted to make money. I see more and more students going into business school because they want to make a difference in the world, and that gives me hope. But we need to give them something as well. I hear too many professors give talks like I do. They're asked, are you optimistic? They say, yes. Why are you optimistic? Because of our students. And what are we doing to help them solve these problems? We're not. And so bringing in the idea of vocation or calling into business schools, the idea of leading commerce and service to society is not a new idea. It's actually a very old idea that goes back to the early 1900s, and it's time to bring it back. There's my book. Thank you.
That was impressively brief. I'm going to set a timer and see if I can get my talk here under 5 minutes. So I wrote this book, Undeclared, A Philosophy of Formative Higher Education. Don't judge a book by its cover, except I'm kind of proud of it because it was co-designed by my daughter Zoe and the MIT Press artist, inspired by this avant-garde doodler named David Shrigley. As you see, this is somebody proudly declaring their undeclaredness. Let me tell you the story behind the title that sort of crystallized things for me. So I was back when I was teaching at the University of Illinois. It's 2017. And I just finished a class, Foundations of Education. One of the students followed me back to office hours, a sophomore. He definitely seemed worried. Something was on his mind, something he needed to get off his chest. Brought him in, sat him down, tried to set him at ease, asked him what was going on. He asked me to close the door. He finally told me his dark secret. Was he seriously ill? Was he on the run from the police? Nope, he was undeclared. Now, websites, university websites will tout exploration or adventure at some point, but nonetheless, or perhaps even because of this, I think it's pretty clear that the lesson on the ground at way too many places is pick a lane and put on the gas. Don't look left, don't look right. It's harder at many places to be undeclared or to transfer than it is to actually, so for example, my daughter Zoe's at Bard College. One thing they do really well is they have a ritual that is built around the idea of a very discerning approach to specialization. You cannot elect a major and move into the senior college, the upper college, until your junior year, and only after you've written papers and met with a board of 3 professors to convince them that you've done some serious thinking about who you are, why you want to specialize in this field, that you're ready for specialization. I think that gets the cart and the horse? I don't know which one. I think the horse goes in front. I think that gets it right, because then the idea is the period of exploration is built in, and it takes work to be ready to specialize. Whereas in many places, you're admitted right into a college, a school, a major, and it takes a lot of work. And, so this poor sophomore, who he had come in to be a computer engineering major and almost immediately felt it was not for him. Now here he was in his 3rd semester, like Hester Prynne before him, forced to wear the scarlet letter U for undeclared, barely being willing to tell me. So at that moment, it crystallized. I wanted to write a book about the university that would name this problem and would give students an alternative way of thinking about their college experience, in which exploration was not only tolerated, but the point of the process in the first place. Okay, so that was 2.5 minutes. Now here comes a really fast summary, and then we'll say more in the questions. So it's a book of essays, 3 long essays, 3 shorter interludes. I'm a philosopher of education, but I'm inspired by people like Montaigne and Emerson. I was trying to recapture something of the humane essay in this book. So they're thematic essays. The 3 long essays, the topic of the first is general education. And more deeply, so what would it mean to take seriously the idea of educating the whole person? I argue that we have some good rhetoric in this area, and we have some formalistic requirements. You know how students feel about gen ed. It's kind of just like a toll booth on the credentialing highway. You're forced to slow down. You're forced to scatter and smatter, as one person put it very honestly. But gen ed is not actually owning up to the challenge and the possibilities of educating the whole person. So that's what the first essay is about. The second essay takes you back to one of the most incredible experiments in the history of higher ed, the amazing, the wonderful Black Mountain College, which flourished from 1933 to 1957 in North Carolina. And it was built from the ground up as a kind of intentional community that was devoted to the formation of all students and all faculty. It was democratically run. It put arts at the center, not because it was an art school, as people often mistakenly say, but because the arts are an incredible medium for general education. The third essay is about vocation, and that's what I'll probably be saying more about once we start doing the Q&A. And what I try to do in that third essay is try to give a more capacious vision of vocational formation and get beyond the two things that we already emphasize, which is technical training and credentialing. And I named 4 neglected tasks, and I'll end with this. So the first, I don't know how we neglect it. I mean, I explained sort of how it could happen and how horrible it is jumping right over what I call the great vocational question: what is a worthy form of work to which you are suited? And I try to show how our superficial ways of supposedly giving students a chance to answer that are not true vocational discernment. Second is cultivating an understanding of the ethical geography in and around your practice so that you can enact your calling with integrity and public purpose. Third is learning how to make your vocation a medium of your ongoing growth and development. And finally, learning how to grow out of your calling if and when the time comes. So I can say more about each of those. Thanks.
My name is Guru Madhavan, and let me start by making 2 interlinked points. First, engineering is peer-reviewed by reality, and likening it to only technology and not sociology is like saying evolution is only gene-based and has nothing to do with culture, and it's like saying economics has nothing to do with behavior and all about rationality. Second, and I want to channel Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who reminded us that we suffer today from much more pluribus than unum. Our world thrives on variety and diversity, but the engineer in me wants a bit more cohesion to tame the chaos. In some, we need some civic operating standards, which takes us to the crux of my new book, Wicked Problems, which actually started as a detective story, to be honest, where an engineer is going in search of solutions for problems that don't have solutions. So that's where, that's the starting point for this book. Engineers, myself included, love to define ourselves as problem solvers. It's everywhere. I mean, that is, I think, the defining, predominant identity for us. That's where the trouble begins. For wicked problems, one must go beyond mere problem solving. Effective problem formulation requires first an awareness of the types of problems that lead to wickedness. So I'll give you 3 types in quick succession. First is hard problems. They are bounded and boundable. Scientific principles, market pressures, sponsor requirements neatly specify them. The outcomes are directed, even dictated, by customers, consumers, clients. If you have used your smartphone to check into your flight or used QR code to order tacos, then these are all results from hard problems. They can be literally solved by remixing, repurposing existing tools and techniques with the worldview that the best possible solution is out there and is achievable. Comparatively, the second type, soft problems, are in the arena of human and organizational behavior. Despite their name, they're anything but soft. With unclear endpoints, thorny constraints, soft problems cannot be solved like hard problems. They can only be resolved. Manufacturing a car is a hard problem, but managing a city traffic is a soft problem, which is actually a harder problem. Adding more roads doesn't necessarily clear bottlenecks. Congestion pricing fails if people can't afford it. So what works for one bridge might not work for the other tunnel. So how do we even decide how much our time is worth? Each intervention creates new perplexities, new problem sets. Since soft problems fuse factors much more than technology, such as financial and the political psychology, the best we can achieve is only good enough. No matter how technical they appear, you simply cannot address soft problems without affecting people and policies at large. And this brings up the essential cultural forces at play, which will become very apparent in the third type, messy problems, which often emerge from our different value sets, belief systems, ideologies, convictions. Let me illustrate this with the disease outbreak. First, we have hard solutions, tracking supplies with barcodes, delivering antibiotics efficiently. We've all experienced that the past few years. Then comes soft resolutions, mapping how the disease spreads, redesigning indoor spaces to prevent infection. Here's where it gets messy. Pathogens develop antibiotic resistance, or when disease control intersects with sacred religious practices, as we saw abundantly in Ebola crisis a few years ago. Unlike a hard problem that can be solved, unlike a soft problem that can be resolved, messy situations can be only abstractly dissolved, which means you have to transform them into an altogether different, possibly manageable state. So how do you reframe centuries-old burial traditions to make them safer during an epidemic while honoring their deep cultural significance? Total messy problem. A hard problem can be optimized. A soft problem can be satisficed. But a messy problem needs to be idealized. These problems aren't really separate. They're nested within one another. And so wicked problems, they need to be solved, resolved, and dissolved simultaneously. This dynamic really requires us to understand how hard problems become soft, and how soft problems become messier, and how hard, soft, and messy conspire to produce wickedness. And then here's the thing with wicked problems, and we'll get to what it is in a minute. We have this familiarity trap. We have grown numb to such problems, almost comfortable. The term climate change has become so routine, so cuddly. Almost, it's in that comfort we find ourselves evading, even disregarding its daily degradations. So in 1973, two scholars, Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber, cataloged 10 properties of wicked problems. They argued that wicked problems contain no definitive formulation. Each one's unique, so there's no start or stop signs. And each problem is a symptom of another problem, so no clear entry and exit points. The so-called solutions aren't really true or false, but good or bad. So what remains are simply opportunities for trial and error. So I'm a systems engineer, and concept development is the heartbeat of our profession. Systems engineering is a convening mindset, not a controlling mindset, to consider all aspects of a problem. A specialist engineer might flee from contradictions, but a systems engineer embraces them with upfront preparation. We have a saying in our trade, pre-work, not rework. Wicked problems require what I call a concept of operations, or ConOps in our trade jargon. So these are narratives about a situation we haven't necessarily experienced. So in practical terms, ConOps address three fundamental questions. First, how would the system work? Second, what functions could it responsibly fulfill? And three, what outcomes should it achieve? In this book, I describe 6 attributes to inform a concept of operations: efficiency, vagueness, vulnerability, safety, maintenance, and resilience. So each chapter goes through their hard, soft, and messy formulations and how they manifest in wicked forms. I'll start concluding here by saying that engineering approaches to wicked problems, such as the ones that have been discussed, can be realized only through multiple criteria. There's no hierarchy among these attributes. Each will produce a revelation, a relationship to the problem, like how good design comes from balance, rhythm, pattern, variety, proportion, and emphasis, and how good composition braids melody, rhythm, texture, timbre, form, and harmony, all in creative tension. You see, all too often, frustratingly, our cultural and commercial ideals are such that, and they taught me this in business school too, and in business school they taught me how to argue, in engineering school they taught me how to solve problems, so I had a personality conflict right there. But ultimately they converged on one thing, which is like, how do you develop a single action item to pursue? So we have developed an addiction for narrow explanations. It's called monocausal-taxophilia, which is the love of single causes that explain everything. Yet, true accomplishments reside in simultaneously understanding the many facets of the problem. Living in Washington, D.C., let me just say this. Wicked problems aren't two-sided issues. They are six-sided issues. An acceptable solution, resolution, or dissolution should go through all 6 filters. We cannot mindlessly prioritize one concept over the other. I'll stop there.
Tough acts to follow. I guess I would say that I'm what Undeclared it grows up to be, which is that I was an English Lit and Religion major at a tiny liberal arts school called Swarthmore. I had no clue what I was going to do with my life. And after it, I spent a year in the Dominican Volunteer Corps, and I worked with medically ill and injured homeless people on the west side of Chicago. And it changed my life, because I would go with homeless people in Chicago and see how they were treated by doctors and nurses, and I was shocked. And you talked about how that there's something that's supposed to be good people in good professions. There's something really weird about my profession of medicine because there's a way in which it makes people worse even though they're doing good work. Every med school admission essay reads the same. Somebody says, I like science and I want to help people, right? That's what every med school admission says, right? That's what they all say, and then they come into medicine and they're miserable. And it's a really weird thing. The Brookings Institute says medicine is the most reliable way to join the 1% in American life. And yet, burnout rates are as high as 80% throughout medicine. And people say they want to help people, but then when we ask our med students how they're picking their specialty, we ask how many of them have looked up how much money they're going to make. They all raise their hands, right? And they're thinking about these questions. And they've internalized this business language, right, pretty quickly. I think about many of the ways in which medical education changed me from a young person who wanted to think about how to take care of homeless people into a person who wanted to get through a day, right, and kind of work through a series of checklists. The story that I always tell people is that when I was in med school, we would do a series of rotations. You spent the year, your third year of med school, driving across the state, and you follow a series of doctors, and at each stop, you had in the back trunk of your car, you had a series of costume changes, right? If I wear pants with pockets on the outside, I'm gonna go into emergency medicine. If I've got a giraffe around my neck, I'm on a peds rotation, right? If I'm wearing a tie, this back in the day was internal medicine. And similarly, I would be a chameleon and go into these different places and become a doctor and encounter people very quickly. In the book, Progress Notes, one of the things I write about is how on trauma surgery, I spent 2 months on trauma surgery as a med student. My job was always to assess rectal tone, right? It's the simplest way, it's one of the core nerve functions, and it was the job of a med student. And you would have this very intimate, quick encounter with a person, and then you would often never see them again, right? And I'm telling you, it's those kinds of encounters that form you in a certain kind of way in relating to other people. So I thought about the ways in which medical education formed and malformed me, and I decided that I wanted to see a different way to do it. So I spent 5 years following 7 med students, let's see if I can count, 7 med students, in an experimental curriculum. Instead of following a series of doctors, they followed a group of patients. And they would go with them to their homes, they would go into the emergency room, into the hospital, and wherever they went. So instead of seeing that patient one time for a very intimate exam, they would see the patient in trauma surgery, then in the OR, then on the floors when they recovered, and then go to the home. And I believe that one of the ways that we have to help young people who have idealism and want to help the world is we have to provide structures where they can flourish and their community can flourish. I believe that in medical education, that means training people in small groups, training med students to follow patients instead of physicians, teaching them to learn from 2 textbooks, not just the textbook of the body, but also the textbook of the community so they know exactly where people live, who they worship, how they live and put themselves out into the world. So for me, it was a great opportunity to see a different way to form med students, and I wrote a narrative book about it, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you about it. So thanks.
Thank you so much. So now that you've gotten a taste of the arguments of each of these 4 books, let's turn to McIntyre. How would you make your disciplines whole? I mean, you've already started to answer, so I think maybe just build upon your answers. I think we'll head back to you, Andrew.
Okay. I think this is more than a theoretical question. We are in a period of flux right now. Academia is changing. The pressures on us are enormous. We could talk about what's happening from the government, but we can also look out in the general public. I just looked it up on my phone to get the numbers right. Recent survey data from Pew, only 31% of Republicans think that universities and colleges have a net positive impact on society. Only 70% of Democrats do, which is, I think, an even more startling number. People are questioning what we're doing here. And I would add a caveat that those 31% of Republicans who think we don't provide any value, also 60% of them still think there's value in a 4-year college degree. So I'll let you make sense out of that. I think one of the bigger threats, challenges to what we do is artificial intelligence. It will fundamentally alter what we do as educators. And that brings us to the question here. If our job is merely to convey knowledge, AI will do it for us. We will be out of a job. But if we are here to help students cultivate and develop wisdom, we will have a chance of surviving in this complicated time. I just finished Anthony Kronman's book, Education's End, Why Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. And it's a real call to say, this is what we used to do, it's time to bring it back, and we'll provide more value to society. So that, to get to the direct question, what would I do to change the fragmentation? I would, first of all, we have become a business. Business schools sell a product, it's called the MBA. And again, as long as it keeps making money, we're gonna keep selling it until someone figures out that we are merely access to a network and they're gonna find another way around us and we're gonna be out of luck. So we have to change how we teach. I would also say we have to change how we think about ourselves as faculty, as researchers. The extent to which research has come to dominate our review, our tenure and promotion, our whole reason for being, and I would add research in journals that are academically oriented, that are theoretically driven, that business people, I assure you, have never heard of, much less read. If they get one in their hands, they will read it and go, what in the world are you people talking about? Because I can't understand your language. And yet that's what we get tenure for. So how do we change that to start to see teaching as the real essence of what we do and not just a side thing that we do while our day job is research?
Thank you for that question. McIntyre has been important for my work. I love the beginning of the book as well. Maybe I'll talk about one particular aspect of it, which is that the dystopian scenario McIntyre gives us is dystopian because people don't know that they don't have a function, in this case, functioning system of science, right? So these fragments, they still pretend to be what they were, right? And so in Undeclared, one of the things I do is a lot of, I'll put it dramatically, zombie hunting. Getting a look at practices that have lost their ethical core, but continue to function, including trumpeting some of the purposive language that once made sense when the practices were integral, but now they've been totally swallowed up by their institutional machinery, and they lumber on as if they're still alive. And I think McIntyre gives us some good language for talking about that, how that relationship between practices and institutions can and should be symbiotic. He says no practice can exist for any length of time unsupported by institutions. But that also institutions do have a way of cannibalizing their practices, and what gets lost, the wholeness that gets lost, is the sort of the sense of the goods that animate the practice in the first place, what he calls the internal goods. And those start to be sort of counterfeited, and the language continues, but actually all that is being pursued are the external goods, promotion, income, U.S. News and World Report rankings. How many of you have a dean who's really stressed right now about going up or down two slots on this ridiculous metric, and so on and so forth? So I guess what I'd say is that McIntyre is helpful for giving us that distinction because of this problem of bureaucratization, where practices get consumed. One last little thing, which is an example of how we've lost wholeness in my field, in this case writing about higher ed, is this deterioration of the gen ed curriculum, all right? So the idea of gen ed, or sometimes we dignify it further with the word core, it's at the center, right? So we all do our special things, but then what unites what we're doing educationally? What should be at the core? What subjects are central to the human experience, most important? So how do we decide that? Well, we have a system at most places that's basically kind of an interdepartmental trade embargo or something, trade treaty. So yeah, you can have your 8 classes certified here in philosophy. If you can have your 8 classes here certified in biology, yeah, I'll send some of my students over to your side of the campus if you send some of your students over to my side of the campus. And what gets lost is the sense of wholeness of what does it mean to be an educated person? Our answer, which is currently very unsatisfactory, is, well, at Boston College, it's 120 credits, so I'll use that number. Someone who's completed 120 credits with a major and checking the distribution requirements. And of course, that's not an educated person at all. That's a credentialed degree holder.
So McIntyre is painting a world where knowledge is scattered in fragments, and it lacks a scientific cohesion, and we are unable to make sense of it. There's no unifying narrative. That's a pretty disturbing patchwork indeed, but I think there's engineering mirrors some of it, which is It's also splintered in segments. It's hyper-specialized to the point beyond recognition. And each segment of engineering is potent, and it's serving a constituency, a market, but are ultimately, I think, disconnected from a shared purpose here. So given this picture, I've been thinking a lot about my ancestors from 6,000 years ago who built the Indus Valley, the first advanced civilization that we look at. So McIntyre is talking about a world that has undergone an apocalypse, and then we're looking at the residue of it. But then my ancestors essentially started from nothing, and they, out of the blue, out of nothing, imagined sophisticated food production, grid town planning, drains, dockyards. So what they were doing, to use our modern vernacular, was not merely civil engineering, but a form of civic engineering. Now, you cannot create a framework such as that by being specialized. You have to really think holistically. And what did they first choose to focus on? Sanitation. And that is something, whenever I give talks to engineering students and everything, I ask them what's their favorite technology and everything, and everyone says Apple, AI, and everything. I mean, so I talk about sanitation, without which everything crumbles. So we don't really talk about that hidden infrastructure that is life, not just life-preserving, but life-enabling, life-giving kind of work that engineering was focused on. We just don't talk about that often. And that could not have, that kind of consciousness could not have emerged from piecemeal hyper-specialized engineering. That is something we have just utterly lost. And of course, there are ideas saying that everyone should have a bachelor's degree, should be a general engineering, and then they would not be allowed to specialize until their master's or whatever it is, or make everyone undergo systems engineering. And there are problems there as well, because the way aerospace engineers practice systems engineers is very different than the medical device types like me. And so it's even there, people just create these archetypes based on their market needs and based on whatever is profitable. So we have a true conundrum here, because engineering as our original profession, we were tool builders way before we were discoverers, politicians, and everything. These were official choices we made as a society. These towns were built in a specific way to do this. Even though the Indus Valley was short-lived, subsequent civilizations really, some of the earliest sewer systems that were in the Indus Valley subsequently influenced Rome, and then you got Bazalgette basically reforming the structure of London and taming Thames, and then now they look at the grid planning in New York City and everything. So you can really track the influences that have come and not written down. So how do you convey this kind of holistic sensibility is something that we're all struggling with. So I'll leave it at that for discussion here.
Sanitation is definitely my favorite technology. I'm pro indoor plumbing. Indoor plumbing seems like an amazing achievement.
Yep.
Much better. I'd trade it for my smartphone any day of the week. I too love McIntyre and have been deeply influenced by him. And I think there's a lot of ways you could answer that question. I'll answer it with a story, which is to say that when I go around the country and talk about this book, I've learned to ask med students, how often do you get to spend time with the faculty? And at many schools, even some of our best med schools, they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, how much time do you spend talking to the faculty? And they'll say, none. And they'll say that they'll round on patients on the floor in the morning, see the faculty, and then they're gone. And then it's a new faculty member the next week. And the thought, I was with Dr. Chisholm last week, and she talked about a time when she might have med students and residents over to her house, right? And when you ask a med student or resident today if they had that, they don't. When I was in training not that long ago, I still had hair then, but it was in the recent past, we would be in the hospital with layers of other physicians, and it was social. And most of what my med students and residents have today is asocial. They study alone, they work alone, they train alone. And I would say that one thing that I think is clear in McIntyre is that you learn through friendship. And I think that one thing that is deeply being lost is that idea. You asked this question, what's going to remain after AI, right? Most of some big component of medical education was always memorizing things. There's 14,000 medications I can prescribe, right? And at one time we would memorize all of those. All of these things we'd have to memorize. That's deeply unhelpful today. The real question becomes how you exercise wisdom and judgment. And I believe with McIntyre that you do that through friendship. So I would say that's the biggest thing that I think's been lost. Friendship with people in the profession, and then friendship with the people that we call patients. Thanks for the question.
So there's a deep humanness or humanity to each of these 4 books that is really concerned with the communal dimension of our contemporary life. I'm thinking of the textbook of the community in Abraham's book, or civic community in Guru's, or common good in Andrew's. So why, and I think I've already started to hear it in your answers, your previous answers, but why is the communal dimension so important to your work? At least I thought that it was. Go ahead.
Start down here. If we continue to produce business students that care only about making money, we're doomed. It's that simple. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate in economics, says the practice of capitalism today is exploitive capitalism. I know the system's broken. It's not my problem. I'm going to get what I want, and I'll let somebody else deal with the rest. And again, if we produce people that think that way, we're doomed. At the end of the day, if we're going to solve things like climate change or income inequality or the gender pay gap or living wage or you name the issue, it has to come from the market. The market is the most powerful institution on earth. Business is the most powerful entity within it. You can lament that fact, but it is a fact. The buildings we live and work in, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the medicines that we have, the healthcare system we have, the sanitation systems we have, they all come from the market. And so if the market isn't directed towards solving these problems, which the market presently is causing, they will not be solved. And if we don't have people within the market that will steer their organizations to address those issues, they will not be solved.
Maybe I would tackle it in 2 ways. First is to say that it shows up in my book, first in the essay on how we're sort of losing the ethos of an idea of the public goods of higher education, as an interlude on that. The second is in the long case study on Black Mountain College. One of the things that's clear about this amazing place was that community was just the central through line of everything they did. So, for example, it was collectively and democratically run through a series of these kind of town hall style, sort of like town hall style meets Quaker meeting meets encounter group. They were always working on everything from questions like, at one point they had an incredible debate over the budget was almost down to zero. Should we put the rest of what we have into fences, because some of the fences were falling down, or into pianos, because there were more music students and not enough pianos in tune. I think pianos won out. They were not always the most practical place. So these communal meanings and a kind of ethos of mutual recognition. It was a very small place. And when I first started writing about Black Mountain, I thought, well, people are going to just think, oh, this place was small, it was short-lived, it was a long time ago. How does this help us scale up programs for the modern multiversity? And of course, I'm not trying to replicate the modern multiversity. I'm looking for ideas of what it would mean with integrity to build communities that are formative. But it turns out that the Black Mountain people right away knew that they would be looked upon this way. And so they actually went sort of on the offensive, and they talked about the importance of scale in learning and having a community that was small enough that you could be known, and how important it was to be known by the people you were teaching and learning with. So community was central to the middle essay of my book. And I want to bridge off of Abraham's comment. Abraham, you mentioned about sort of I love your book. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Doctors following their patients. And one way we could talk about this is getting to see the whole patient, right? If you only see the patient's, sorry, your example, rectum, that you're not seeing the whole patient, right? But if you're following them into community settings and through different specialists, you are. So you might say, well, hopefully we already have that covered in education. Of course we don't, right? And the word that sort of stands in for what should be there is this word faculty. Does faculty mean everybody who's employed by the university in a certain role, or does it mean a collective body that is thinking together about teaching and learning? And one of the inspiring things about Black Mountain is they kept this ongoing debate about how are we doing? What does it mean to be educated? Are we achieving that? And it's amazing how seldom it is that a group of faculty can gather and say, this student, are you seeing a different side of them in your class? What's going on for them? Having a chance to slow down. Of course, we all have to be sprinting at all times. Having a chance to slow down and talk to each other so that we can get a look at the whole student and then teach the whole student. So a couple different things about community.
Since at this forum we're also celebrating the power of poetry, I thought I would talk about McIntyre's other influence that doesn't get talked about much. That occurs in his epilogue. He alludes to it, and it's a Greek poem from 1898 that's translated as Waiting for the Barbarians. Okay, and so in the poem, it's a city-state is in decline, and the people and the lawmakers are just waiting for the barbarians to come through the gate. So when the night falls, the barbarians have not arrived. The poem ends, "What is to become of us without barbarians? Those people were a solution of a sort." So the society, according to this poem, had come to depend on a threat of barbarians as a distraction from their own internal problems and agony, a force that was required to unify them, give them the focus, their society, some primary purpose or identity, or even a convenient excuse to avoid the real problems. So it's all about the barbarians and they haven't really arrived, so we're not going to fix our act, whether it's in business school or education or medicine or engineering. So now, without this external threat, the society must confront its own uncomfortable truths. And I don't think we have that reflective capabilities, or maybe have we completely filtered it out, is the question that we need to think about this. Institutional decay, lack of purpose, hollowness of leadership, and the pointless meetings that I go to. And so it's like the barbarians have become the psychological crutch kind of thing. I'm not saying that this is what inspired my book, but I think it was a point that I made earlier. How do you develop a civic know-how from an engineering sense? The engineering acts of know-how predate the scientific aspects of know-what. So if that's the case, then how do you truly engineer civic engagement? And are civic traits trainable, much like aviation flight training? And so that's the second half of the book, in which I go through an unknown engineer, essentially, who needs to be celebrated, who pioneered flight training, which proved as vital as flight itself, eventually. And that's why we take safety for granted now and whatnot. So I think from an engineering perspective, from this engineer's perspective, civic engagement should be made more structured, systemic, and survivable through all these onslaughts. So we don't have to sit around and wait for barbarians.
The short answer to your question is, why do I care about community? And the answer is because health is social and relational. So Brendan Case is sitting here, right, and when they do the human flourishing projects, they consistently show that this question is, health is not an individual thing. You raised the question of McIntyre. He writes that we're rational, dependent animals. Health is not an end in and of itself. It's, I need to be healthy so that I can be in the life of my children, in the life of my parish, in the life of my neighborhood. So first of all, it's a disaster to say health is an individual thing. Right? Whenever you read the story about a tech bro who wants to live to be 140, it's a deep human failure, because they're not saying, I want to live to 140 so that I can participate in human community in certain ways. It's just, I just don't want to die. The longer thing to say, though, is that this question has a history about why I care about the textbook of the body versus the textbook of the community. We have made a choice to make medicine this way. And in the book, one of the things I talk about is how 125 years ago, a group of philanthropists and universities got together and said medical education and training and practice should be centered around the research university. To be clear, there is a great good of that. I'm pro-science. It's awesome, all the things we've learned. But a great deal was lost. And if you look at that, there were more women in the 19th century medicine on a per capita basis than there were in the United States until the 1990s. There were more black men practicing medicine in the United States in the 1890s on a per capita basis than there are even today. When we tied medical education to the research university, we closed the doors to who could do this training. In the 1850s, medical education in this country was wildly unstandardized. Oliver Wendell Holmes went to Harvard. It was 2 years, and the second year was a repeat of the first year, right? It was a very different medical education system. So tying it to the research university was a decision we made. And when I came up with this phrase, the textbook of the community, because the people who organized that did something that's famous in medical education called the Flexner Report, where they visited every medical school in the United States, often for only 3 hours. And they evaluated the med school on the basis of, do they have a research lab and do they have a cadaver lab? And the author of the book wrote that the cadaver lab is where the whys are brought to book, because it was important that you actually see what you did as a doctor and what was actually going on inside the dead body. There's a wisdom to that. But I don't believe the whys are brought to book just on dead bodies, right? I don't think that's where wisdom is only learned. And in the Flexner report, when they talked about my home state, they talked about how the state had 5 medical schools, and it recommended that they shut down 4 of them. And it wrote about my hospital, and it says, in the general interest of the community, that the safety net hospital's education should be transferred to the research university, the University of Colorado. But there's no account of what counts as the community and what's its general interest, whether or not the community wants to have physicians that represent them, that know them, right? The assumption is that being tied to the research university was in the general interest of the community. And there's some great good to that. For the last 100 years, we have seen life expectancy explode in the United States. Explode. It has gone backwards in the last several years. And it's gone backwards because of diseases of the community. It's diseases of substance use, some of which was advanced by medicine and its role in the opioid epidemic, mental health, suicide, what they call the diseases of despair. Those are diseases of our communal life. And that's why I believe that a physician should absolutely know the textbook of the body. It's important that a physician do a dissection, that they know the heck out of their biochemistry, right? But they also need to know about their community, and they need to know how people stick themselves in the world, in Walker Percy's phrase. So I'm a fan.
Let me just add something triggered here. I think I'll blame some physiologists or engineers here, because the whole idea of bodies treated as machines, and I think that's a very pernicious worldview. And there are TikTok videos that saying your body's a machine, you can do X, Y, and Z, and so forth. And I think that has done a great disservice to the point that Abraham is making about how we have just completely, become devoid or not considering the social implications of the work that we do.
I work very hard in all my writing to call people away from those kinds of metaphors, and that I insist that you ought to use organic metaphors. I believe your body's more like a tree than it is like a machine. I know your body's not a tree. I am a psychiatrist, but I get that. But your body's more like that. So I wrote a paper a couple years ago called "Health Equity is Not a Spectator Sport." There's this famous image of health equity as like watching a baseball game. Has anybody seen this? Right? And so we instead proposed one where you could say that health equity is more like a group of trees sharing a forest together. Right? And I think we need to think very consciously about the metaphors we use. And because oftentimes we're using these metaphors that then shape the way we think. If we say that, in my field of psychiatry, people are common want to talk about brain circuits. There are no circuits in your brain. There literally are not, right? There are neurons, there are neurotransmitters, there are chemicals, but we can also talk about the ways in which those things are affected about the community. And they are, right? The evidence is very clear that the way that you live, we saw this with Dr. Milkman last night, right? She talked about these kind of healthy behaviors and how profoundly they affect life. That's textbook of the community stuff. Do you have a place where you can exercise safely, where you can eat healthy food, where you can have a stable relationship? Those things matter a lot, as much or if not more than the medications I can prescribe.
I would add quickly, this machine metaphor is central to our environmental problems as well.
Yeah.
Nature is a machine. We can tinker with it. We can take it apart. We can put it back together. It goes back to the Enlightenment. Its modern manifestation is climate change. We caused it by accident, but we'll just geoengineer the planet and fix it on purpose.
Yes.
Because it's a machine that we can tinker with.
Right. Well, so I made this joke, this kind of provocative story about assessing rectal tone. Why was it the med student's job to assess rectal tone? Because it's a very simple, it's one of the last nerve reflexes to go if you get a serious injury. And the idea was that a med student couldn't mess that up, right? And I get it. I understand why we did it. We would assess for rectal bleeding, assess for rectal tone. And the more advanced physicians would assess the airway. And an even more advanced physician would assess brain function. And so it's in that way that we organized the team, we said that the lowest ranked person would assess the most simple mechanistic function, and the highest ranked person would assess the most complex mechanistic function. But no one assesses the whole person. And why in the world they're showing up in a trauma surgery bay on a Saturday night, which is the real question, right? So it's absolutely critical that you study the textbook of the body, but you also need to know why it is that this whole person account. So, thank you, Anna.
Great, so for this next question, Abraham, we're going to start with you and then.
I'll go shorter on this next one. I know what's coming.
No, we're fine. Oh, you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so many of the issues that each of these authors treat, they inherited. So students arrive at college or business school or med school as products of an educational system. So my million-dollar question is, if you had one thing that you could change about high schools today, what would it be?
You skipped a question. I had a short answer to the virtue question.
I did.
You did. I'll answer this one though. So I am so fortunate to have awesome kids. I married up. I married this awesome person, and we have great kids. And one of them is my daughter, who's 17, and so she's in high school. So I think about this question. And for me, the most important thing about her high school education has been the cross-country team, right? And it's been the cross-country team. She's smart. She loves to read. She's got a room crowded full of books. Whenever she goes out on a run, she gets books from the little free library. She makes her own jewelry. She's constantly making jewelry. She makes pottery. She loves to be out in the world. And she has kind of an ambivalent relationship about school because it's mostly about grades, and it feels transactional to her. And cross country is a no-cut sport, and everybody runs together, and you can see your progress, and you can talk and make friends along the way. And so this past month, I saw her run super fast. She ran under 5:30 for a mile for the first time. And I asked her why, and she said, what I love about track is that I get to talk to the other girls before and after the race from the other teams. And I was like, you're gonna be fine, right? Like, if that's what you like about track, awesome, right? I feel like I'm winning the game. And so what I would say that what she needs more than anything is something where she can have friends, right? Where they can work together, where they can see progress, and that they can feel themselves built up, right? She didn't like running when she started. And now she sees how the effort builds her up rather than tears her down. And she doesn't always experience that in the high school class itself. So that's my answer.
So from India, and I went into engineering like an arranged marriage, really. I mean, because that was what was expected. Everyone around me was doing it, so I did it. And it's only years later I fell in love with it. And so that said, I sometimes wonder why in this country, uniquely in this country, we try so hard to make STEM exciting, sexy, to get more people interested in this. And that has sometimes, made me wonder here. And I think high school should focus not on the sexy, but the vexy, because the students are capable of understanding the complexities of the world, and it doesn't have to relate to reducing it down to a robotic contest or whatever, some coding or Python, whatever it is. But I think we need to first examine a fundamental choice that we have made in this society, which relates to politics of recognition. How we have over-prioritized innovation, niftiness, newness, novelty against the kind of the more dull, diligent, humdrum work of maintenance. 80% of engineers work in operations and maintenance. They don't run around chasing disruptions like Silicon Valley. They've worked to prevent disruptions.
Sanitation.
Yeah. So let's go back to Indus Valley, focus less on Silicon Valley.
Thanks, thank you.
I'm a philosopher, so I'm very practical. So here's a practical solution for high school. Maybe it would be a good start for them to teach students Marx's distinction between use value and exchange value. Okay, that's it. Not serious, except it is, because what I want is some recognition that there is a purpose to learning other than the value of a credential being defined by what you can trade it for. Now, it's just hard to blame K-12 for this, though, because it is a whole system, right? So K-12 is bent out of shape in part because of the goal of getting people into the best college they can, where best is defined as the one that rejects the most people. There was a hilarious thing online 10 years ago called the Journal of Universal Rejection, where you could upload a paper and it would immediately send you a rejection saying, congratulations, you have been rejected from a journal with a 0% acceptance rate. So we have a whole system here, but high school teachers and college teachers alike, we need to start creating a counter discourse that there is a difference between studenting and learning. And that there might be a college that's right for you that isn't necessarily rejecting slightly more people than some other one on the list. So some kind of counter discourse that gives people, I mean, I don't know about you, but students arrive at BC, no one has ever talked to them about the purposes of education. They're completely, they're 100% sure that the purpose is like Pac-Man-esque to get those 120 credits, meet those requirements, and nobody has ever said, well, what are we doing here? Why do we call it higher education? Why not higher further schooling or higher training or grades 13? Is it grades 13 to 16? Philosophy, not math, but I think I got that right. I think we call it higher education because there's supposed to be a somewhat different logic. You're supposed to be able to take more of a lead in your education, for example. But how can you do that if nobody is actually creating a space for you to think about what it means to be educated, how you've been shaped so far? A lot of times when students arrive, I have to start with a kind of like cult deprogramming, sort of like, let's create a little safe space here. What just happened to you? What was that K-12 schooling? What was it for? Why did nobody ever talk to you about what was happening? Why did no one seek your permission? What were the aims of education guiding the process? And what do we think it means to be educated? And how do you want to start taking the lead in light of an ideal that captivates you? So I think that's on higher ed as much as the high schools, but together perhaps we could start to create a counter discourse about the difference between sheer studenting and actual learning.
Did you see that David Brooks had an editorial in New York Times earlier this week that this is the most rejected generation because they're constantly rejected?
BC just moved up from 16% rejection down to 14.
Yeah.
We're really excited.
Michael Crow talks about this a lot at Arizona State. When I think about this question, I think about the book Excellent Sheep. I don't know how many of you have read this, but our students are excellent. They're really smart, but they're sheep. They're chasing shiny baubles. They're looking for the external affirmation. They're losing a sense of who they are. I sit on a scholarship committee for high school kids in college, and I see kids submitting resumes that they start at the 5th grade, and it nauseates me because what you're teaching kids is your life can be summed up on a piece of paper to be evaluated by somebody else. And I see that with our students. They're very concerned about what other people think of them, and they're looking for those credentials. You can see, look at your students' LinkedIn pages. I just got a new certificate in X. They're constantly doing this because they think this is what they're supposed to be doing, rather than they're looking for that external affirmation rather than that internal motivation. Business schools do this too. I mean, I don't know about your campus, but for the most part, business schools are in an arms race to make the most impressive buildings, which becomes a shiny bauble. And students look and go, I don't know what they do in there, but I want to go there because it signals power, success, money. And they enter an environment where they don't have the defenses, the clarity in who they are, and they get channeled into finance and consulting. That's where they go. Will they be happy there? Sooner or later, they're going to figure it out. I just worked with a student who finally left McKinsey. That was the brass ring. She couldn't leave because she thought, there must be something wrong with me because this is what we're all supposed to strive for. I felt like I was working with someone who had joined the Moonies or something and trying to extract her because this is what she'd been programmed because she's so afraid of what other people think of her. And that is a very dangerous way to cultivate our young people.
And isn't it amazing how the logic, if you ask somebody, like they were studying history or philosophy, and suddenly they're off to McKinsey or BCG, why? Well, I want to keep all the money, but also I want to keep my options open. Yeah. If I can win the most strict competition, then I can do anything. And I want to say, but yeah, everyone who told me that has ended up in Greenwich managing a hedge fund. Are you sure you're keeping your options open, right? Yeah. But there's this idea of just keep winning competitions.
Yeah.
It sounds like we need to go back to Abraham for the question that I skipped. He's so excited about it.
I love this question.
Okay, great. I'm doing it.
I love all your questions, Anna. You're awesome.
Okay, so if you could choose one virtue that every engineer, doctor, business person, or undergraduate absolutely had to have to succeed, to enter your discipline, what would it be?
Humility. And I'll give my longer answer is that the Flexner Report held up one person as the icon for American medicine, a man named William Osler, who was this amazing physician. And Osler wrote the literal textbook of medicine and founded the idea of medical education. If your students follow a pre-med curriculum, it's Osler's pre-medical curriculum. Most med schools do Osler's training. Even at my hospital in Denver, a place he never visited, the conference hall for physicians is called the Osler Conference Room, right? At my med school, the cafeteria where we ate was the Osler Cafe. He literally was knighted. It's called Sir William, he's named Sir William Osler. For 2 generations, the Eli Lilly Company gave a collection of his essays to every graduating medical student. The book is called Equanimitas, and it's about praising this idea that you have equanimity even when you encounter really difficult events in the life of a patient. And in the book, he talks about how being a physician is a noble calling. So some versions of the book literally print it with a cover of like a heraldic shield. And one thing I think is important for us who are interested in questions of character and virtue is that this part of why people are reluctant to embrace this language that we love so much is that sometimes it's been used the way Osler used it to talk about the individual nobility of those of us in the professions. And I believe that instead we ought to think about our humility. Thanks.
Short answer, moral steadiness. Long answer, let's go back to 1914. British jurist, Lord Moulton, he was the head of the explosives department for the UK in the World War I, and he gave a talk it's called Law and Manners. And he said that the world is divided into 3 sections here, more based on values, and he tried to compare that to a society's strength for each of those sections. The first one was basically the realm of positive law, where you have enforcements, we follow speed limits, we pay taxes on time, et cetera, so these are completely enforced. The second one is in the realm of free choice, absolute freedom, left to individual behavior, do whatever it is. You want to pick up a fruit cup or a chocolate cake on a salad bar, do whatever you want. But then there's this vast middle, what he called the obedience to the unenforceable. So that's where the kind of this moral murkiness comes up, and which is like it's partly enforced, you can choose to act as if you're enforced, or you choose to act you're completely free and so forth. And I think that's the domain where the steadiness that I was alluding to matters. And that's where character comes to light. It shines because it is neither in the realm of duty or ethics or law. I think it's one of those areas that we're all trying to navigate.
Imagination. But not maybe sometimes as it's construed. Like I saw this bumper sticker the other day. Reality is for people who lack imagination. And I know you probably shouldn't get too overexcited about a bumper sticker, but that gets it exactly wrong. That's the Star Trek theory of imagination, right? So I would call that fantasy. What I mean by imagination is actually making more contact with the real world in its complexity, getting past shortcuts, simplifications, cliches, fantasized versions of things. And as a philosopher of ed, I'm contractually obligated to mention John Dewey at least once at every conference. So let me mention Dewey's distinction between recognition and perception. Recognition is the shortcuts that we all need, where we subsume some new phenomenon into the categories we already have. And we would go crazy if we didn't have such shortcuts. But it's important to then also be able to perceive, to take in the new in its fullness and its strangeness and its richness. So I would want people heading into education as teachers to have that imagination in that rich sense.
I would 3 words that circle around a similar thing: wisdom, character, and judgment. As I listen to all,
You get 3?
I got 3.
Okay.
I'm the last one. I listen to the talks, and I feel like everyone's circling around something that's on my mind as I wrote this book and as I think about business education, is we focus on the how of business, but we don't focus on the why. You focus on the how of medicine, but not the why, the how of engineering, but not why. My early career was an engineer, a chemical engineer. And I know that engineering has gone through this self-examination. The Olin College of Engineering has really been focused around the idea of engineering for what purpose, for what benefit, for what people. And I think that central to all of these ideas, we really need to get back to the why.
Okay, so Abraham, I'm going to deviate from the
Do
script
it.
unless anyone was really excited about the recruiter question.
I'm excited about all of them.
You are?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So only those who are excited about the recruiter question get to answer this next one. So let's turn to recruiters in your industries. What would you hope recruiters would prioritize in your fields? What recruiting practices would build character in our emerging adults?
And there were two ways to interpret this question. I was thinking about it, recruiters to get into the school. And you may find this amusing, I do, although scary. There is solid research to show that students who apply to business school scored high on what's called the dark triad: narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. There is also solid scientific research, social science research to show that when they come to business school, when they leave a two-year degree, they self-monitor more, they care more what people think of them, and they become more selfish. And so I would like recruiters to weed out those that score high on the dark triad and bring people with more pro-social attitudes.
So I was going to say, so my wife is a family medicine program director, and so she actually is this recruiter, right? And she'll tell you that she looks for people who've had a substantive work experience before med school, people who have played a Division I sport, people who have grew up in did military time. And so she's looking for these markers where people had some sort of character experience. In a shorter version, I did medical school and residency at Carolina, and the program director in my program would always look for point guards. Karen wanted point guards because she believed point guards would set the table for other people. And I would just observe that whatever metric you use, at the end of the day, those are the things that people are picking, right? Healthcare in particular, physicians are paid the same based on, irrespective of where they went to school, right? And so ultimately character is what matters, right? And that's whether your nurses are going to like working with you, whether your patients are going to like working with you. And we ought to select people for it, right? And there is, in fact, plenty of studies showing that people who are high character, who aren't part of that dark triad, we get plenty of those in medicine too, are in fact the people that people want to have as their doctors ultimately. So I would recruit it that way.
I was telling Abraham at the thing last night that I had a student last semester who was a second semester senior. We're in a class called the Educational Conversation, and she's off to med school, and she said she was really liking the class and that she was excited that in her last semester she could finally take classes that would stretch her and that were her, interesting to her. But that the first 7 semesters were all about, she said there's a difference between a 3.93 and a 3.92 for getting into the school she wanted. And now she was finally into med school. She was going to explore art and philosophy and English.
And I'd want her to do that, all throughout the way, right? She's going to be a better and more interesting doctor if she does that throughout all, right? Ultimately, the real question is what happens, why do we get sick, and what does it mean to receive medical care? And there are some really good answers from the biomedical literature, but most of the best answers for that are not from a medical textbook, right? What does it mean to be sick is not a medical question, it's a human question.
Guru, you want to go next, or?
Well, some of us became engineers to avoid working with people. So it's a little bit too philosophical for me here, but I think well, I think in terms of recruitment, I mean, there's a certain bent that kind of gets attracted toward engineering and so forth. But I think in terms of recruitment practice, I would focus on judgment under complexity, really. I mean, there's this big trend these days, wherever you look, people are celebrating failure resumes all the way. How many TED Talks get rejected, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, okay, why don't we just then, in terms of all the business and the monetary accomplishments you see in a CV, why can't you maybe emphasize an ethical dilemma or something like that? And I think that kind of gives the recruiter or the employers a greater choice set, I would think. Not too profound, but I think we can encourage such information.
If we think about faculty recruiting, so if we want higher ed to move in a more formative direction, we need teachers, professors who embrace that mission. And it's not a surprise that in many places, that kind of language seems very strange. The socialization of the professoriate is around pleasing your dissertation committee, is around, getting a certain kind of journal article accepted. So, I mean, we have to start by saying to the search committee, you have a charge other than finding the sort of, most published specialist in a sub field. We have to somehow spread the idea that we're looking for, people who are intellectually alive and have a rich kind of generalism. Not a dilettantism, not thinness, they know what it means to go deep in a subject, but they also are reading widely, engaging in all kinds of conversations, and have thought about the education of undergraduates before the moment they're hired, and suddenly they have their first class and they encounter something called a teaching load. So I think the recruitment process at higher ed, I think many people in this room are already working on this, but we have a lot of work to do given the default of how a search committee is set up.
Okay, so to preserve time for our general conversation, what I've done is I'm taking Guru's question, but asking you all to answer it, okay? So Guru, I was gonna wonder whether you would define building character through the professions as a wicked problem, and I'm gonna pretend that your answer to that is yes already, okay?
Yes, and I've gone one step forward with that homework assignment here, because I tried to apply this concept of operations framework to this question here, because how would you take an engineering approach to build a character? Maybe that's not a fruitful question. Maybe let's uncover what character is across these contexts using this engineering framework. So I took those 6 concepts, and I just jotted down some notes here. First, efficiency, okay? Right, character basically manifests as a streamlined alignment from action to intent, so you want to conserve as much moral energy as possible in terms of that whole, the flow here. So also depends on the clarity. A professional feels when their decision cuts through some competing demands and so forth. So it's a matter of efficiency and how do you go about consolidating these different variables or assessing trade-offs there. Second is vagueness, and I think that is abundantly clear. A character thrives in ambiguity. We talked about the unenforceable domain with Lord Moulton here. The third one is vulnerability, which is characters inherently exposed. There is this element of fragility, propensity to failure here. There is this nervousness, this raw courage of taking on something that's beyond you. So there are aspects of that. It's not the standard risk mitigation framework that engineers try to put in a chemical factory or something like that. The fourth is safety, and this is where what could be otherwise just totally brute force clear in an engineering sense takes on a very different dimension when you explore a concept like character. What is safety when it comes to character? Is it a moral harbor where it's a space where ethical choices can stand firm without an external threat? And again, that's extremely contextual, and that's where the messiness kind of comes to the fore here. Fifth is maintenance. Character requires constant care work, constant tending, much like a system requiring upkeep to avoid delays, let's say in the New York City subway system or something like that. So that I think it's a natural synergy there. And finally, resilience. Character of professionals, they have to endure significant moral turbulence, bending without breaking. So, and I think that's a kind of a self-preservation part of it. So this was my approach of filtering. So the character in this case doesn't easily lend itself to a solution, resolution, or dissolution, but all three are required to make sense of a specific problem set.
Okay, great. So nobody can measure up to that. So let me just reframe for everyone else. So for the remaining 3 speakers, either a closing comment on how to build character in your profession, or you can just answer the question that I wrote for you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here and to be on this panel with these folks. To me, I think that the question about how to build character, right? I think the first thing is that we ought to prioritize a true liberal arts education in undergrad, and then recruit folks into that from medical school after they've done some lived experience in the world where they have some awareness of what it really means to be sick and to receive care. And then I think we ought to train people in places where they can form relationships with themselves and their patients, and that they can have friendship. I also think we need to think about, I'm the only one up here whose education system is paid for by you, right? Every time that you get paid, a portion of your Medicare funding goes to graduate medical education. You pay $30 billion a year for medical education in the aggregate, and yet we don't distribute that to serve community needs across the country. So I think we ought to redistribute where we train doctors and where they practice so that they serve community needs. So And then I guess the last thing is I'm pro-reading, right? I think that's one thing we all share in this room, is I think we ought to recruit more readers. Thanks, Anna.
I'm also pro-reading, as long as we're saying that.
That's my politics right there.
So just to build on that, I mean, I think we have to make sure we realize that we don't have undergraduate liberal learning simply because we have a college that's known as the liberal arts college, or a set of disciplines known as the liberal arts. What matters is the culture of institutions and the stance of students, right? So following philosopher Michael Oakeshott, we could define liberal learning as that kind of strange engagement when we set aside momentarily the usual instrumental question, how do I get what I already learned to want, and wrestle with this much more uncanny question of what's worth wanting, to have, to be, to become, to participate in. And it's the kind of question that arises and closes down. It can't be just left permanently sort of flowing like a fountain in the middle of campus. You have to keep finding a way to raise that question. And, you know, there are things we could do. I mean, we talk about uniting living and learning, but it's challenging. We need to create, I'll give you one example. We need to create what I'll call, not like other people use this term, but a third space. And what I mean is an alternative to spaces that are intellectual but academic, and spaces that are non-academic and anti-intellectual, like beer pong or something like that. I think we need a third space that is intellectual but not tied to courses. This is the ideal, right? That in dining halls and dorm rooms and long drives to away games, people could talk about ideas. You might even, you know, want to say that there was a moment in your philosophy class that was kind of interesting and you're not sure what to make of it. So we need to create a culture of conversation on campus, and culture change is probably a wicked problem. It's not enough to just add a new program called transformative education. I created one and I'm admitting it. Like, transformative education means thumbs up, right? How do you actually create a culture where people are going to read in the right way and not read, as Deresiewicz says in that book, to, you know, that horrifying story of the kid at Yale who reads the summaries of lots of books because he doesn't have time to read books, but he knows he has to sound, you know, well educated.
And now AI will do it for him.
AI will do it for him, yeah. So that's a bit, yeah.
Okay. What can I add? I mean, this conversation is important for all of us. It's important for the future of higher education. It's important for the future of the country. We are in this period of turmoil. We are in a period where people are questioning what we're doing, and we should be questioning ourselves. I think the worst thing we could do in this moment right now is put up the barriers, circle the wagons, resist all efforts or pressures for change. There are some legitimate criticisms out there that come from people we may not like to be criticized by. And so how do we, as a group, start to further this conversation across the university, across colleges? The question that was given me is, why am I optimistic? And I'm not. But I'm hopeful. Optimism is looking at the odds, saying they're in my favor, I'm going to do something. Hope is saying I don't care what the odds are, I'm going to do it anyway. Hope is a verb. Hope has accomplished far more than optimism ever accomplished, especially in the face of an uncertain outcome. That's what we're facing. And so we have to have the hope of the people around us to join in this common endeavor to try and fix what is broken in higher education and preserve what is good within it.
Thank you so much. If you can join me in a round of applause.
Aaron, does that mean we're going to have beer pong indoors? Is that what you're going to tell us?
We have time for audience questions, and so we have two microphones, one on that side, one on this side. If you raise your hand, we'll bring them to you. Okay, you're next.
Thank you. I'm Chris Rapella, Dean of Engineering at Marquette University. I love everything you're talking about in terms of transforming and think differently about education. We talk a lot about this, but I think central to that is the way we do our reward system in academia, right? Our reward system is for a long time involvement about me, myself, and I. Are you the PI? Are you the first author? Do you have your own independent lab, et cetera, which I would say actually goes against this idea of creative problem solving, where I think the rest of the world has figured out if you want really creative solution problems, you need people with all kinds of different skills and strengths coming together, right? And yet academia doesn't reward that. It's all about me, myself, and I. So I'm just curious, as are you seeing places where there is being will change maybe in that reward system, that will change what people do in the classroom and the way they behave in an academic environment and that sort of thing.
I can get started on that, because that's something I've given a lot of thought to. I mean, there's a classic paper in business education, The Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B. This is what we reward, this is what we get. But there are changes happening. In the business school world, where I'm mostly associated, we're starting to see an effort to broaden the tent of what it means to be a professor. There are multiple ways to do this now. Do you want to be focused on teaching? Do you want to be focused on research? Do you want to be focused on impact and practice? At the Ross School, we've added a fourth criteria in our annual review. You have research, capital R, teaching, small t, service, infinitesimal s. We've added a fourth called practice. Are you impacting practice? You can actually get letters in your tenure packet from business people. Did you impact how people think about the world around you? And I would add one last thing, and this is a plea, but I've been trying to push my colleagues. I want to see more of my senior professors act like what I call elders. They're not concerned about their own career. They're concerned about the institutions that the next generation will come up in. Do I need a higher citation count? No. Do I need a higher H-index? No. That will not, at the end of my days, make me feel like I lived a satisfying life. But we now have the power and the position and the wisdom to try and change the institutions. The senior faculty have that role. The problem is we got too many senior faculty thinking like junior faculty and chasing more and more citations, chasing more and more papers, and blowing the beautiful opportunity they have. A full professor is a gift that few people in this world ever get. And take full advantage of it.
But as Dracewitz says, if you're trained to be a hoop jumper, why assume that it'll turn off, right?
Yeah.
So now that you have full, you have to try to get that name professorship and so on and so forth. I would say that one thing I love about Boston College is that the T is definitely less lowercase and the S less infinitesimal. I see genuine evidence of that really mattering in deliberations. The other thing we should also say is that taking research seriously, we could do a much better job of that, right? So instead of like publication by the pound, sheer numbers, if somebody writes more of a kind of article that is not good, that's worse for the world, not better, right? But just the idea of just heedless industry and the assembly line moving faster and faster, so fast that we don't really have time to read each other's work and actually say, like, is this imaginative and deep and helpful? When I arrived at Illinois, they told me there was a fourth way to go for tenure, practice, and then they said, don't do it. Yeah. Do not, there's...
Lower on the status.
And so the question is, is that just paranoia, or is it the kiss of death for your career to take one of these novel routes? So I guess I just want to echo, it's the right question to ask, and we need to figure out how to do that, Yeah.
I heard two proposals once, and they were more provocations than proposals, but they're intriguing as a thought experiment. One, what if you could only, in your career, publish a certain number of articles? You'd only publish good articles. Second, the day you get full, the next thing you have to do is sum up those 14, 15, 16, 20 years of research into one document, a book, and write it for a lay audience. That would scare that shit out of my colleagues, but it would change their sense of who they are and what they're here to do.
Yeah, I will just say, I had an experience, I was on service a couple of weeks ago with one of the resident physicians who's an MD PhD. He called out my H-index score. He'd looked it up, and I was like, I hadn't looked at my H-index score. And he was like, I've noticed that you've started to publish fewer, articles in PubMed. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting that he would look into that. And I would say that for me, that was the gift of becoming a full professor, was to say, I don't care. I want to write the stuff that I really want to write. And so I've written for Plow recently, or Virtues and Vocations, and it gives me joy and pleasure, and it helps me think through some things. And I think it's beholden on those of us who reach that point to be good leaders. Early in my career, I had the privilege of working with an amazing guy named Stanley Hauerwas, and Stanley would always become second author on a lot of his books or bring on junior authors, and he would do it intentionally. I also had the chance to work with another guy who I won't name, who did it very differently and would really see that relationship with working with other people as a chance to publish things for himself and not for the other person, and kind of take advantage of that. And I think it's beholden on those of us who are professors to say, we really have to model this for our colleagues. So when I want to write a PubMed paper today, I want to do it with a junior colleague who needs that work, and I get the chance to build friendship with that person. So I think it's beholden on us. So, yeah, please.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I'm Jesse Pappas from the University of Virginia. So the referendum for character in the university really couldn't be clearer, right? So for instance, the 2025 World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, 7 of the top 10 skills demanded, desired by employers are character strengths. All right, this kind of data is reflected by the OECD, McKinsey, Accenture, LinkedIn. It's there, the demand is there. So with this crystal clear referendum, why does it feel like we're still sort of singing for our supper with the 440 or 400 different arguments rather than just taking our seat at the head of the table where we belong?
I guess since I just said humility is the virtue I want, I don't know that I want a seat at the head of the table. I just want everyone to be able to enjoy the table, right, and to do it well. And I guess I would say we don't reward that, right? Like, in my world, right, in medicine, there's some people who are bad behaviors. Sorry, different kind of bad behavior, Suzanne. Bad apples, let me put it that way. Bad apples, am I allowed to criticize apples? I'm pro-apple. But whatever metaphor you'd like. There are some people who misbehave and get rewarded because they provide other goods, right? Financial goods or things like that. And so
I think I missed.
Yeah.
So my question is, why does it have to be so hard? Like why do we, right?
And I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think we're rewarding character in a lot of our promotion and our financial rewards, et cetera, right? What I'm trying to say, I think, is that if I was a physician with bad character, but a lot of NIH funding, at least historically, and a lot of PubMed fundings, I could still be a professor. There's not actually, the citizenship score, which is what we do, is pretty small in that. And I think we have to change those metrics, right? Because it's what patients care about. Patients don't ask me about my H index vector, right? They want to know, like, am I available to them? Am I going to listen to them? Am I going to be courageous when I have to disclose something to them? So I think we've misaligned the incentives, is my answer.
And can I add something? Bringing character into education is not as easy as it sounds. It requires a different mode of teaching. It requires a different mode of professor. When I'm imparting knowledge, I stand in front of the classroom. I'm the center. I am imparting knowledge. I pour it into their brain. They will think like me, make good decisions. That's facetious, but that is what we do. Developing character is more like learning a craft. You can read a book about how to swing a golf club. You're not going to be able to play golf until you actually swing a golf club. So as professors, I teach a course called Management as a Calling. I don't teach. I create an environment, run the exercises, put them in a context in which they find character through their own discernment process. That is a very different role for me. It was very uncomfortable at the beginning, and I have a lot of colleagues who will not go there because they lose control as they see it.
But if you clarified the demand from industry, would they be more likely to go there? I guess that's the question, right? Like, it seems like the line is so direct.
If they're trained to teach, let me back up, because how many of us were actually trained in our doctoral program? I wasn't. But if we are trained and rewarded to teach in a certain way, the idea that we can automatically transition into another way of teaching, that's a tall order.
Is there a question over there?
Hello, thank you. Ruben Rosario, St. Louis University. I love this conversation. I love the various perspectives. I come from a Jesuit Catholic Research University where we just underwent what we call the curriculum wars. And it was a real battle seeing especially the STEM areas argue that we don't have room in our majors for ethics, for philosophy, for history, and we have seen our core curriculum eroded to the point that outside of, at a Jesuit school, the one theology requirement, everything else in the core curriculum can be done in your own department, in your own major.
Wow.
And I think that really undermines the wisdom that, say, the humanities bring to the conversation. It really undermines the model of a classical liberal arts education. At the same time, I'm hearing, and not just from the panelists, but from folks at the law school, folks at the med school, these candidates are lacking a certain humanity. right? And so my question is, what's being done at the professional level, at these schools, at these colleges, medical schools, business schools, to integrate a core classical liberal arts education into the formation? I teach a course called Markets and Morality, which is the intro required theology course, team taught with an economist for students in the business school. There is a similar model for those in the medical pre-professional sciences. But that's one course, and so I'm curious, going to end with my question with this. A generation ago, Ohio State University was recruiting folks in the humanities without the necessary science background to medical school, would then give them a kind of a crash course, bring them up to where they needed to be. And now a generation later, some of these folks are heads of their specialty at major medical schools. Your thoughts?
I think the key word that you said there was to integrate the core curriculum in their overall education, because it's not enough to have a robust set of distribution requirements if those are just felt like these kind of curricular wormholes where you suddenly find yourself a different part of campus doing this thing. So what sounds ideal is, the class you teach, because of that team teaching, that fusion, right? So there are, business schools will sometimes say, read, at BC, students read some Kant and Mill before, right in the beginning, the Portico program, and I do hear good things about it. But I also hear okay, I passed the test on Kant and Mill, and now I get on with my business education. So what I like about what you're saying is the idea of bringing that study of ethics into close relation. So when you said that most of the core courses are now just in the areas, I feel like there's a good version of that and a bad version of that. The good version of that means that people took the time to craft courses that have the richness of the courses had they been hosted in the home humanities departments, but have a connection and a dialogue with what you're doing so that it doesn't feel like you just did this kind of tourism and you were reading Dante for a while and you have no idea why, and now you're back trying to fulfill your major requirements.
Yeah. I think you mentioned this question about Ohio State and its experiment with medical education. There's a great book by Barr about 20 years ago that Johns Hopkins Press published, Questioning the Pre-Medical Curriculum, and just showing that we've overemphasized the research sciences as preparation for med school, right? Because med school's funny. You don't actually ask a med student to discover anything new. Like, nobody wanted me to raise my hand to my anatomy professor and be like, I've discovered a new pancreas, right? Like, no one wanted to hear my opinion about things, right? Going to Swarthmore and studying English Lit was bad preparation on some level for anatomy, because it wasn't a question. Nobody wanted you to critique, how the liver looked. They wanted you to just find it. So there's all kinds of evidence, actually, though, that long-term, the liberal arts pays out. I think that part of the problem, though, is that there's two ways, at least, that the incentives are misaligned. One is that if you're an admissions officer and you have LCME, which is our accrediting body on this side, you have to make them happy, right? And in the short run, some of those med students who studied French literature, right, may actually be bad at the first 2 years. And they may be bad at passing step one and all these things. And then that reflects poorly on the school, which damages their accreditation, which makes life the admissions officer done. The other way, which I think speaks to your question, your Virginia, right? Which is that if you think about it, it's a challenge for a group of people who are senior in a field to choose people to enter the field to replace them who are different than them. And so that most med schools are populated with kids who are really good at STEM and have gone through that pathway. And so they can relate better to folks who do that. And so they're the ones who are the gatekeepers to that. So even though the evidence is actually on the side of what you're describing and you're describing, the folks who are making those decisions have institutional accreditation and, frankly, cultural reasons not to make those choices, right? And that's part of why we have troubles when diversifying our classes, right? Is that we're used to thinking about a certain group of people being the right person to be a medical student, and it's usually people like us and people who can pass the immediate tests we've got, and not the payoff 20 years from now when they're going to be an interesting chair. Does that make sense? So that'd be my answer.
And if I could add something.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if someone's talking. Okay. My name's Amandi. I'm a PhD student at Notre Dame, and I'm a biologist. And my question to you is about graduate education, maybe from your own experience, or I guess like the work that you're doing now that reflects back on graduate education. What I have found is that it's very difficult for people to digest questions about meaning and purpose when you're kind of pigeonholed in like this technical field, right? It feels so new, and it feels like bringing a big idea is immediately shut down. And what I've been trying to figure out over the past couple of months is, how do you condense it into digestible components that can, in a very subtle way, push people to think differently, right? Especially in their time of training. And maybe you have a reflection based on your own graduate training. What was that like for you? What do you wish was just like given to you in like a small, digestible little bit that maybe is a seed that you can, like that then unraveled over time? Because I think that for me, that's where it's at. I don't think that I would see this huge shift, like people will like turn the page and then all of a sudden like recognize the importance of all of this. But I think that what we can do is plant a seed. And I'm wondering what your answer would be to like what that seed could be.
I mean, I think anybody who's up here, I think we might all agree that when you write a book, you have to figure out what you believe, and it's really hard. And so it just takes time on some level, right? I guess I would say you're asking the right questions, but there's a season in your life when you're learning how to form them, right? And I would just keep working on it. But it's hard to really answer those questions well and to figure out how to communicate anything well in a short package. So I'd keep doing it. I guess I would just offer encouragement to you, right? I think most programs ultimately want you to ask those questions, but they may not train you how to do it.
The metaphor I've tried to use of thinking about your career is that of a jazz musician. To be a jazz musician, you have to start by learning your scales. You have to learn your craft. But that doesn't mean
That's good.
you totally bury your passions and your ultimate objectives. Over time, you learn how to play somebody else's music, and then eventually you're going to play your own. You're going to define Professor the way you want it to be. You have to cultivate those spirits as you grow forward, but you do have to. I tell my students that academic papers are your cod liver oil. You have to swallow it. It tastes awful, but it makes you healthy in academia. The world is thus. You have to live within it, but keep that spirit alive in you and develop it as you go along and start to ask those bigger questions as you advance.
We have one more question, I think.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Hi, my name is Rich Eva. I direct Character Forward at Duke. And yeah, this has been great so far. I definitely resonate with a lot of the things you've expressed. One of the things that was brought up was the sort of rampant careerism in students, and I thought it was wise that you noted it kind of starts with, it's in faculty as well. And I often get the sense like I want to, shake my students and tell them like, money's not the only thing that matters in life, right? But then sometimes, at least recently, I've started to wonder, I've just started to question this, especially having young children, because sometimes it can feel almost selfish to think of education as like an intrinsically valuable thing and not about the money, because that money directly translates to like a very practical thing, like sending my 1-year-old to a daycare where she'll be picked up if she cries versus like ignored most of the day. It's like this very, like that money is very important. What do we do with the fact that like students need this and are being like told that's valuable, but we also want them to cultivate this this love of learning?
Is there a problem with including that in a list of goods? For example, we also want, we want work that's paid, but we also need meaningful work in which hopefully there's some creative control. I'm skipping over a bunch of really important things, like work that is moderately safe, that has some respect in society. So what would be wrong, to put the question back to you, with sort of taking a pluralist account here and saying, being well paid for your work is one of the goods of work. By itself, it's a disaster. Let's talk about those other goods. How are you going to grow through your work? Will you have any creative control? How does this help other people? Does this actually speak to your own gifts, your talents, your interests? So my first attempt would be to say, like, all right, let's include it, but let's add it to the longer list.
And that making money isn't an end of itself, right? It's a great thing to say, I need to make enough money to care for my children, right? That's a wonderful thing to say, right? But that's the way I would engage it, is of course there's a certain amount of money that is required for material sustainability. But I'm always reminded of the theological statement, right? That a heresy is when you take one truth out of relationship with other truths. And the truth is you need to figure out childcare, right? How to nurture children. But, you know, there's a certain amount of money that does that, and then there's a certain amount of money that's well beyond that.